I'd like to firstly welcome and say good afternoon to everyone who is joining this online public meeting of the Socialist Equality Party entitled The Bondi Terror Attack, a Socialist Assessment. My name is Max Boddy and I'm chairing this meeting. And this afternoon we will hear from two speakers, Oscar Grenfell and Cheryl Crisp, whom I'll introduce shortly. After their reports, we'll open up the meeting for questions and discussion, followed by a call for our monthly fund and some closing announcements. Now, before I introduce the speakers, I want to set out a few essential points. Today marks 4 weeks since the December 14th Bondi terror attack, which killed 15 people and injured many more. It was the deadliest domestic terror attack in the country's history and the second deadliest mass shooting. It has shocked people here and internationally. The Socialist Equality Party, the International Committee of the Fourth International, and the World Socialist website condemn this attack unequivocally. It was a reactionary, cowardly act of terrorism and must be rejected without qualification. Among those killed was a 10-year-old girl, 2 elderly Holocaust survivors, foreign nationals, and local people. The attack was apparently driven by the reactionary ideology associated with Islamic State. That ideology blames the crimes of the Israeli government and US imperialism not on capitalism, but on Jews and other so-called infidels, using this lie to justify the slaughter of innocent civilians. Jewish people in Australia and internationally bear no responsibility for the genocide being carried out in Gaza by the Netanyahu government. Thousands of Jewish people have joined the mass protests against the slaughter. Responsibility lies with the Israeli state and the imperialist powers that arm, fund, and politically protect it. States such as Australia and the Albanese Labor government, along with its state counterparts. What is responsible is not Jews, but a definite capitalist ruling elite. Israel is a bourgeois nation state, the outcome of Zionist politics ruled by a political, military, and corporate oligarchy that has ruthlessly oppressed the Palestinian people since its formation in 1948. It uses nationalism and Zionism to suppress class opposition at home and to carry out imperialist violence abroad. The Netanyahu government represents this ruling class, not ordinary Jewish people. The SEP and the ICFI condemn the genocide in Gaza and the Zionist regime responsible for it. The mass killing and destruction now underway, which began in October 2023, flow from a long-standing policy of occupation, blockade, and military violence carried out by successive Israeli governments since 1967. This has been backed to the hilt by the United States and its allies, including Australia. Even before the current slaughter, Gaza had been reduced to a devastated territory long described as the world's largest open-air prison. The present assault continues that policy in its most extreme and criminal form. Since October 2023, the genocide has sparked some of the largest protests in Australian history. Tens of thousands of people, including many Jewish people, have taken to the streets, in most part on a weekly basis in this country, against the slaughter and against Australia's complicity. The Labor government, state authorities, and the corporate media have responded by denouncing these protests as anti-Semitic, deploying police against demonstrators, and invoking laws to restrict and criminalise opposition. This was the backdrop to the events of Sunday, December 14th. At about 6:40 p.m. that day, Sajid Akram, aged 53, and his son Navid Akram carried out a coordinated armed attack on the Hanukkah by the Sea gathering at Bondi Beach. They had travelled there from a rental property in Campsie in Sydney's southwest, where they had been living in the weeks leading up to the shooting. The two men brought multiple firearms and improvised explosive devices to the site. From positions around the footbridge overlooking the park and the beach, they opened fire into the crowd. Although the explosive failed to detonate, the gunfire caused immediate mass casualties. 15 people were killed and a dozen more were wounded, some critically. When the shooting began, people in the crowd tried to intervene. An elderly couple attempted to disarm the father and was shot and killed. A local business owner later managed to wrest a gun from Sajid. The shooting continued until the police arrived many minutes after the attack began. And Sajid Akram was killed by the police at the scene, and his son was wounded, taken to hospital, and later charged with multiple counts of murder and terrorism-related offences. Within a little over an hour from the first shots fired, police raided the southwestern Bondi home where the Akram family lived, using a Bearcat military personnel vehicle. What has since been revealed is that the two men were not unknown to authorities. Naveed Akram had been on the radar of police and intelligence agencies for years. ASIO has confirmed that it conducted a 6-month investigation in 2019 and 2020 into his associations with individuals and groups influenced by Islamic State. At that time, he was linked to 2 men later convicted of terrorism offences for their support of IS. Philippine immigration officials have also confirmed that Sajid and Naveed Akram travelled to the Philippines in November, just weeks before the attack, visiting a region known for the presence of Islamic State-linked groups. Despite this, Australian authorities have claimed they had no warning of what would unfold on December 14th. While many questions remain unanswered about the lead-up to the attack itself, the ideology that motivated the shooters was reactionary communalism associated with the Islamic State. This political current turns the misery and anger created by imperialist war, economic decline, and social breakdown into ethnic and religious hatred. It targets Jews, Westerners, and secular opponents as enemies, justifying communal violence that blocks the development of a class-based political struggle against capitalism, the real source of violence and oppression. The attack was therefore the product of a profoundly anti-working class, counter-revolutionary ideology that seeks to fracture the working class and divert social anger into sectarian violence. Equally reactionary has been the ruling class's response. From the first hours, governments and corporate media sought to blame the atrocity on the anti-war and Palestinian solidarity movement. The slander promoted internationally that opposition to Israel is anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism was seized on to explain the shooting. It was even suggested that the 300,000 people who marched across the Harbour Bridge on August 3, 2025 were somehow responsible. In this way, the ideology of the state and of the terrorists converge. As our SEP statement noted, quote, "The ideology of the Islamic State that motivated the Bondi shooters is based on an inversion of the same lie, that all Jews are Zionists and therefore responsible for the slaughter in Gaza," end quote. On this basis, Labor governments have moved to expand emergency powers and demand inquiries that are, in practice, mechanisms to criminalise protest. Now, the events following Bondi cannot be understood in isolation. They are part of an international drive by the ruling class to impose war, repression, and authoritarian rule in response to a deepening global capitalist crisis. The most naked expression of this today is the Trump administration's neo-colonial assault on Venezuela. In the early hours of the morning on January 3rd, US Special Forces carried out the abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, while US warplanes bombed targeted in Caracas, and American naval forces imposed a blockade of the Venezuelan coast. At least 40 people were killed in the opening stages of the assault, which constitutes a flagrant act of war and a violation of international law. The purpose of the operation was the forcible reimposition of US control over Venezuela's vast oil and mineral reserves, which Washington regards as a strategic prize in its escalating confrontation with China and Russia. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, along with the immense deposits of gold, coltan, and other critical minerals, making it a central target of US imperialist expansion in the Western Hemisphere. The attack also marked a decisive break with any pretense of legality. The Trump regime openly repudiated international law and the sovereignty of Venezuela, replacing it with the doctrine that Washington has the right to overthrow governments, seize territory, and dictate political outcomes whenever its strategic and corporate interests demand it. Now, this aggression abroad is inseparable from the drive towards dictatorship at home. The same ruling class that bombs Caracas and kidnaps a foreign head of state is simultaneously expanding police powers, militarizing immigration, enforcement, and unleashing deadly repression inside the United States itself. This was underscored only 4 days later, on January 7th, when ICE agents shot dead Renee Nicole Good during a raid in Minneapolis. War abroad and repression at home are not separate processes. They are two sides of a single class strategy. Now, this is the political context in which the Bondi attack is being exploited in Australia. The atrocity is being used to manufacture fear and moral panic to legitimise sweeping anti-democratic measures, including new laws in New South Wales that give the police minister and the police chief the power to issue a statewide, quote, public assembly restriction declaration, end quote, after a declared terrorist attack for up to 90 days. And protests in New South Wales, and particularly in Sydney, have been banned for at least a month. Now, these powers are not aimed at preventing violence or to protect Jewish people. They are aimed at silencing mass opposition to war, to genocide in Gaza, and to the broader agenda of militarism and austerity being imposed by the ruling elite. The events of the past 4 weeks, from the Bondi attack to the US assault on Venezuela, have shown how quickly major political crises now erupt. 2025 ended with the deadliest terrorist attack in Australian history, and 2026 began with a US imperialist invasion aimed at seizing control of Venezuela. For workers and young people who want to understand what is really happening, the problem is not a lack of interest, but the lack of historical understanding and access to a socialist analysis of events. To facilitate this access and to aid the development of class consciousness among workers, young people, and professionals, the World Socialist website launched Socialism AI on December 12, 2025. It is a chat-based AI system designed by the ICFI, harnessing the full archive of the World Socialist website, drawing on the classic socialist works, including those of Lenin, Trotsky, Marx, and Engels, and the political record of the International Committee. It enables workers and youth to place contemporary events within an historical and theoretical framework as they strive to understand and respond to the rapidly transforming political and objective situation of the 21st century. The fact Socialism AI was launched just 2 days before the Bondi attack was a coincidence, but it underscores the urgency of the task now confronting the working class. Socialism AI does not replace political struggle, thought, or the role of the working class and SEP members. It strengthens them by giving workers the historical and international perspective needed to organise, confront state attacks, and build a socialist movement. And I encourage all attendees here today who have not done so already, register for Socialism AI at the close of this meeting and begin using this vital resource for your political education. Now, with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Oscar Grenfell. Oscar is a member of the SEP's National Committee and plays a critical role in leading our youth and student organisation, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. He is a prolific writer for the World Socialist website and has authored many articles, including key analyses of the Bondi attack and its political implications. So welcome, Oscar.
Thanks, Max, and greetings to comrades and friends. The event that we're discussing today, the Bondi terrorist attack, was clearly an immense tragedy, a crime that robbed 15 people of their lives, wounded dozens more, and left scars, both physical and emotional, that will last lifetimes. Masses of people in Australia and around the world were horrified by the experience of December the 14th. But this was not a random incident of criminal conduct. It was a political crime with political motives. And the same is certainly true of the response from governments, the media, and the official political parties. Their response is not dictated by disinterested, humane concerns for those that perished, but by class interests and by politics. So our task today is to examine the politics of the attack, the way in which the ruling class is using this to pursue its own ends, and to formulate a response that advances the interests of the working class. Such an assessment can't only be based on the events of the past month, but has to draw on historical experience. It's not a question of finding an identical incident from the past or of seeking to manufacture such an identity, but of drawing parallels from which lessons can be derived. Later this year will mark the 25th anniversary of the September 11 terrorist attack in the United States. On that day, 19 hijackers took control of 4 commercial airplanes, and in the space of several hours, the carnage they unleashed claimed almost 3,000 lives. That was the biggest number of fatalities from a single event in the US since the Civil War. 15 of the hijackers were Saudi Arabian nationals. It would later emerge that several of them were being monitored by US intelligence agencies in the lead up to the attack, and that they also had unusually close ties to Saudi Arabia's American embassy. The alleged mastermind, Osama bin Laden, was also well known to US agencies. In the 1980s, bin Laden and what would become Al-Qaeda collaborated with the CIA in a war against Soviet forces in Afghanistan. Bin Laden would have a falling out with the US in the 1990s. He represented a dissident wing of the Arab bourgeoisie, dissatisfied with its treatment by American imperialism and seeking to secure a more favourable arrangement with Washington. Politically, the September 11 attack was motivated by a hardline variant of Sunni Islam, one which was incessantly promoted by the Saudi state over the previous decades, and it was motivated by a reactionary and false identification of the American people with the American government. Almost overnight, before any questions about the perpetrators or their attack had been answered, the American ruling class and its allies seized upon September 11 to carry out policies that would impact the lives of hundreds of millions or even billions of people. Notwithstanding the obvious ties between the Saudi Arabian state, an ally of the US, and the attack, there was an immediate drumbeat for war against Afghanistan. That would go on to become the longest-running imperialist war in modern history. And then 3 years later, completely false claims of a link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, augmented with lies about weapons of mass destruction, were used to justify the illegal 2003 invasion of Iraq, which killed up to 1 million people. I think it's now widely recognised among masses of people that those wars had nothing to do with combating terrorism or championing democracy and human rights. They were brutal, neo-colonial wars aimed at stealing oil and other resources and securing control of geostrategically critical areas of the Middle East and Central Asia. The response to September 11 entailed not only war abroad, but a massive restructuring of political life domestically, centred on boosting the powers of the state and attacking democratic rights. Trump's attempts now to establish a presidential dictatorship are aimed at finishing off an authoritarian turn by the American ruling elite that was dramatically accelerated 25 years ago. It should be noted that this was an international phenomenon. In Australia, it's estimated that more than 70 pieces of legislation have been passed since September the 11th, restricting basic civil liberties. The attack 25 years ago then was the classic case of a murky terrorism incident immediately being exploited by the ruling elite to pursue unstated aims. But the same is true of the Bondi attack. Only hours after the shooting had ended, governments, the media, and all of the institutions of capitalist society went into overdrive. The terrorist atrocity, they all insisted, was the result of mass opposition to the Israeli genocide in Gaza, the solution was to ban all demonstrations and to repress opposition. The line was set by the Labor governments, both state and federal. Premier Chris Minns immediately declared he would recall the New South Wales Parliament to ram through unprecedented legislation. The laws provide the police commissioner with virtually unlimited powers to ban public assemblies for up to 3 months in the wake of a terrorism designation. Police Commissioner Mel Lanyon duly exercised that power, and he extended it for another fortnight at the beginning of this year. That means that if we or another political movement in New South Wales wishes to hold a protest, for example, against the war on Venezuela, it will be unauthorised, which means that police can move against it and participants can potentially be prosecuted. Minns laid out most explicitly the ideological rationale for the ban and for the broader crackdown of which it's a part. He referenced the August march across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which centrally opposed Israel's deliberate starvation of the Palestinians. Minns said, and I quote, "We can't risk another mass demonstration on that scale in New South Wales. The implications can be seen, in my view, on Sunday," that is, in the Bondi shooting. Now, it should be recalled that Minns was referring to a protest that involved up to 300,000 people, or over 5% of Sydney's population. His assertion was nothing short of a slander against the population at large, and it was the argument of an authoritarian. Every dictatorial regime of the 20th century asserted that political opposition was illegitimate because it was criminal. If such opposition was not repressed, it would lead to disorder and violence, such as terrorism. The claim that people protesting the genocide are responsible for the Bondi attack is based on the big lie that Israel and the Jewish people are one and the same. That line is itself anti-Semitic, identifying the diverse global Jewish population with a militarist ethno-state that functions as an outpost of imperialism in the Middle East. It's refuted by the history of Zionism, which is a modern political movement based on reactionary nationalism, not the 3,000-year history of Judaism. And it's also exposed by the fact that large numbers of people around the world of Jewish descent have joined the mass opposition to the genocide, including in this country. The other big lie that's being put forward is the attempt to tie the perpetrators of the terrorist attack to that mass anti-genocide movement. As Max has already gone through, the only things that we really know about the Akrams is that they were apparently Islamic State supporters and that they'd been on the radar of the domestic intelligence agency ASIO. Islamic State, or IS, is a frothingly sectarian outfit based on Sunni extremism. It's not only anti-Semitic, but it's also violently hostile to many Muslims, including all of those who adhere to the Shia school, as well as to secularism, democracy, and to socialism. The protest movement, on the other hand, has been multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and secular. It's explicitly rejected anti-Semitism, and it's drawn a distinction between Judaism and Zionism. There's absolutely no question that the terrorists would have been intensely hostile to such protests, which cut across their whole communal outlook. In all of the endless coverage following the Bondi attack, very little has been said about IS itself. Here too, the anniversary that I began with is relevant. Contrary to the lies of the Bush administration, al-Qaeda had no presence in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, who brutally repressed any challenge to his rule, including from the Islamists. But it was able to gain a foothold in the chaos following the 2003 US invasion as Iraqi society disintegrated. And in this, the US was not a passive bystander. It used the age-old tactic of divide and conquer, including initiating a program to arm and fund hardline Sunni militia in 2005. The clear aim was to undercut any influence by the Iranian state associated with the Shia school in Iraq. A key turning point came in 2011 when the US helped to provoke a civil war in Syria aimed at toppling the regime of Bashar al-Assad. In its largest operation since the arming of Islamists to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the CIA poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the Syrian opposition, along with vast arsenals of weaponry. That opposition was composed of al-Qaeda-linked Islamists, one faction of which would go on to establish IS. The US only turned against IS when it declared its caliphate in 2014. The decision of the group to cross back into Iraq from Syria and to seize control of Mosul was viewed as a threat to the stability of the region and to US dominance. But this was very much a tactical falling out. That's made clear by the fact that the US continued to support other Islamist factions in Syria, culminating in the toppling of the Assad regime in late 2024 and the coming to power of an Islamist government headed by Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, an al-Qaeda terrorist. The central point here is that the emergence of IS was the direct outcome of imperialist intervention. First of all, the ravaging of Iraqi society in the US invasion, and then Washington's conscious policy of arming, funding, and training an Islamist opposition in Syria. IS is completely embedded in the sectarian policies promoted by Washington, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, and it's particularly hostile to the Shia majority regimes, such as Iran, which are also in American imperialism's crosshairs. Now, while IS has sought to exploit the genocide in Gaza, it has a long-standing and well-documented hostility to the fight for Palestinian liberation. It has denounced the Palestinian struggle as a diversion from the fight to establish a pan-Islamic Sunni caliphate, particularly through the prosecution of communal war against the Shia. When IS sought to establish a presence in Gaza in the 2010s, it carried out terrorist attacks, including against Hamas officials, before being repressed. The character of IS as a bastard offspring of imperialism is completely off limits in the official discussion. So too are the many unanswered questions about the attack itself. It has been admitted that Naveed Akram, the younger of the two attackers, was investigated by ASIO for 6 months in 2019. He was being scrutinised because of his close connections to an Islamic State supporter who was convicted on terror charges. But despite this, we're supposed to believe that the Akrams somehow fell off the radar, that the father was then allowed to obtain a gun licence and to purchase 6 high-powered firearms, and that together they could plan and perpetrate their attack without ASIO having any idea of it. It should be recalled that every year since September the 11th, ASIO has listed Sunni Islamic extremism as the most probable threat of a terrorist attack. The investigation of Naveed Akram in 2019 occurred under conditions where IS had already carried out a series of mass casualty attacks in Europe. None of this is going to be examined in the Royal Commission, which was announced by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on Thursday. The Commission is hardly even an investigation into the circumstances of the Bondi attack itself. Instead, its entire focus is to witch hunt the mass opposition to the genocide as a threat to social cohesion that must be vilified and suppressed. Albanese has already declared that his government will implement the recommendations of a report released last year by Gillian Segal, the government's special envoy to combat anti-Semitism. Segal, who is nothing less than a Zionist lobbyist, demanded that the government set up Zionist censorship of the entire press, that it defund public institutions that permit criticism of Israel, and that it enforce pro-Israeli propaganda, including in the schools. The recommendations, which Labor has now accepted, are the framework for a police state, as is the protest ban in New South Wales, but much more is being prepared, including further rafts of so-called hate speech laws, threats to restrict immigration based on political beliefs, and so on. In our response, the SEP has drawn particular attention to Labor's role in spearheading this offensive against democratic rights. It's of a piece with Labor's backing for the genocide itself, politically, diplomatically, and materially, including through the export of weapons components to Israel. This is not simply a question of Minns or Albanese as individuals. The fact that Labor is implementing authoritarian measures, not dissimilar to those of the fascist Trump, expresses the essence of this party, a party of imperialist war and of reaction. We've also drawn attention to the response of the Labor-aligned trade union bureaucracy. Leading union bureaucrats, such as Jared Hayes of the Health Services Union and Luke Hilikari, the head of the Victorian Trades Hall, have publicly demanded a complete end to pro-Palestinian protests, echoing the lie that they're somehow to blame for the terrorist attack. This is a deepening of the role that the unions have played throughout the genocide in blocking any industrial action whatsoever and in covering for Labor's support for Israel. Now, the response of what we term the pseudo-left has been diametrically opposed to that of the SEP. Socialist Alternative, one such pseudo-left outfit, published an initial article about the attack, which didn't even mention Labor at all. Instead, it focused exclusively on the role of the Murdoch media, the Liberals, and One Nation. Socialist Alternative's second article, published on the cusp of the new year, presented Labor as the hapless victim of a far-right campaign after the attack. These two articles said literally nothing about Labor's role under conditions where it was moving to ban protests in New South Wales and where Albanese was leading the charge to implement Segal's report and to conflate the anti-genocide movement with the terrorist attack. In effect, Socialist Alternative was hiding Labor's assault on democratic rights from its supporters and readers. Its first article of the new year was headlined, quote, "Supporters of Palestine must stand up to the post-Bondi right-wing offensive." But again, it was not against the Labor governments that Socialist Alternative said people should mobilise. Instead, the clear implication of the article was that workers and youth should come to the defence of the Labor governments. The article drew a direct identity between Socialist Alternative and Labor. It warned that the far right, quote, "want to strike a blow against the political left." That is a term that Socialist Alternative uses to describe itself, but also that the far right wanted to strike a blow against the Labor Party. The response, the article said, had to be standing up to an emboldened and rabid political right. The clear message was that it was necessary for workers and youth to build a popular front-style movement encompassing Labor, the unions, the Greens, and the pseudo-left against the far right, and that even as Labor is spearheading the agenda of war and repression. This is a continuation of the role that Socialist Alternative and the pseudo-left have played throughout the genocide. They've insisted that the mass opposition can only go forward through moral appeals to the Labor government to see sense and to end its support for Israel. The function of this line has been to subordinate workers and youth, incensed by the genocide, to the very government that's complicit in it. Far from shifting to the left, Labor has shifted further to the right in response to the mass opposition, which in the meantime has been politically neutered by Socialist Alternative and other pseudo-left forces. In the wake of the Bondi attack, the other pseudo-left groups, such as Socialist Alliance and Solidarity, have raised really only the need for more protests, again appealing to, pressuring the governments to halt their attack on democratic rights, even under conditions where protests in New South Wales are banned. These organisations, whatever their occasional left-wing rhetoric, are proving in practice that they're an adjunct of Labor and of the political establishment. Under conditions of a sharp shift in the situation, where Labor's true role and class character is exposed, they do everything they can to conceal it. That's because they speak for an affluent layer of the upper middle class, which advances its own privileges within the framework of the existing political setup and of capitalism itself. Through their opportunist electoral campaigns, the pseudo-left seek to develop ties with the Greens, and some instances with Labor itself. And the leading members of these organisations are increasingly integrated into a Labor-aligned trade union bureaucracy that functions as a police force for governments and corporations. The pseudo-left, in other words, is a last line of defence for the political setup, not an opponent of it. Now, just to conclude, I think in understanding the response to the Bondi attack, the context really is crucial. The repressive measures that the governments are implementing can't be explained as a response to the Gaza protest movement alone. The governments are aware that they're sitting atop a social powder keg. Labor is completing Australia's transformation into a frontline state for a US-led war with China. That includes the AUKUS Pact to purchase nuclear-powered submarines from Washington, a vast expansion of US basing arrangements, and unprecedented domestic military spending. As the consequences of these catastrophic preparations become clearer, and as the working class recognises that it's going to bear the cost financially and in terms of lives, opposition will only grow. The vast diversion of resources to the military, combined with the crisis of global and Australian capitalism, means a program of class war. Labor is tasked with cutting vast sums from social spending and of overseeing a productivity offensive to drive down wages and conditions. On the social front too, major struggles are inevitable. The critical question that we're raising is the need to draw political lessons from past experiences. That includes recognising the bankrupt character of protest politics oriented to the powers that be, which serve only to bolster illusions in governments that are implementing a program of militarist barbarism and authoritarianism. What we're raising is that the defence of democracy and the fight against war requires a new political perspective. That perspective has to be the fight for the independent mobilisation of the working class directed against the Labor governments and the entire political establishment. Such a movement must have as its aim unifying the vast power of the working class internationally, abolishing capitalism, a system that's hurtling to the abyss, and establishing a socialist society that's based on equality, the rational distribution of society's resources, and peace. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Oscar, for that, I think, thoroughly detailed and critical report, which worked over, many different critical elements that we can develop upon in the question and discussion area, which will follow after our next speaker. And I just encourage those in the chat. I noticed there's a lot of discussion back and forth, which we certainly welcome, discussion and questions. But I really encourage you to listen to this final speaker and flowing from that, then raise your questions and we'll get to them in detail in the questions and discussion section. But with that, I will introduce our final speaker for this afternoon, Ms. Cheryl Crisp. Cheryl is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party. She's a founding member of the Socialist Labour League, the forerunner of the SEP, and has played a central role for decades in the development of the Trotskyist movement in Australia and internationally. So welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Max. And I also would like to welcome all those in attendance at our meeting this afternoon. My comrades have outlined the events of December the 14th, 2025, the response of the various sections of the state, governments and the media, and they've also explained the attitude of the SEP and the ICFI, so I will try to endeavour not to repeat many of their points. it is undeniable that we meet under the shadow of a crime that has shocked Australia and reverberated internationally. The Bondi terror shootings of December the 14th, in which 15 civilians were murdered at Bondi Beach. The death toll could have been far higher had the 4 homemade bombs thrown into the ground that day detonated. The first and most immediate responsibility of the SEP was to condemn this massacre unconditionally, to extend our deepest sympathy to the families and friends of the dead, and to oppose every expression of religious, communal and racist violence. This we did. It must also be stated that the SEP is the only organisation that has held a meeting where ordinary people can discuss what is a shocking event. Now, there may be differences with our assessment. We have created a platform where those differences can be discussed, but there is no other venue where they can be discussed. Now, the issue has to be raised is why not? The question of the clarification of what is, without a doubt, an unprecedented act in the history of Australia, certainly since its founding, is something that warrants political discussion and discourse. No organisation, no political formation has done so. The reason that we do is to create the conditions where the connections from these events, whether they be held here or internationally, can be clarified, brought together, and the basis of them understood. We have made clear, as Max and Oscar have insisted, that Jewish people are not responsible for the crimes of states, whether those crimes are being committed in their name. The attackers, apparently motivated by the Islamist reactionary ideology of Islamic State, are the political enemies of the working class. Everywhere they attacked the vulnerable and sought to sow division and ethnic hatred. Their actions have strengthened the capitalist state, not weakened it. Our movement stands against every form of communalism, sectarianism, and reactionary violence. But the analysis of the Bondi atrocity cannot be exhausted by condemnation alone. As with all major events, there are the stated reasons and then there are the real reasons. We warn that the Royal Commission that Albanese has called is not designed to establish the truth of what happened on December the 14th, or quite frankly, to prevent further ones from taking place. Whatever the purported aims of the terrorists, it has been seized upon as a pretext to push a wider political agenda. Their reactionary motives have already been manipulated by sections of the political establishment to justify measures that pose an existential threat to democratic rights and to working class political independence. Our task is to analyse these developments, locate their material causes, and draw the political lessons workers must learn if we are to resist war, authoritarianism, and the erosion of social rights. At this point, I would like to explain the attitude of the Trotskyist movement to individual terrorism itself. The socialist movement from the early 20th century has opposed the reactionary, sceptical, and counter-revolutionary role of individual terrorism. Its aim is to replace the mass action and mobilisation of the working class with individual acts of violence bred of frustration, impatience, and outrage. The socialist movement fights for the independent mobilisation of the working class as a class bound by a political perspective which serves the interests of that class on an international scale. Socialists fight for the unity of the working class against nationalism, racial and religious differences. The enemy of workers is not their class brothers and sisters in other countries, whatever their skin colour, religion or ethnicity, but their own national and international bourgeoisie. Whether homegrown or foreign-born, the ruling elite represent the interests of a tiny, malignant layer of capitalists and oligarchs, not the mass of the population. So the actions of terrorism only entrench the divisions fostered by capitalist governments between different sections of the working class. It provides the pretext for the intensification of state repression of the mass of the population, and this perspective itself, which was evident on December the 14th at Bondi, equates the crimes of Israel in Gaza with Jewish people, many of whom, with considerable courage, have opposed and spoken against Israel's murderous war against the Palestinian people. The Bondi attack, however, did not occur in a political vacuum. It unfolded at a moment of accelerating global instability. The World Socialist website, the online publication of the International Committee of the Fourth International, issued yesterday a statement by the US Socialist Equality Party, which explains the turning point that characterises the political situation in the US and internationally. It highlights two events, 4 days apart, in the opening days of 2026, which are intrinsically linked: the US invasion of Venezuela and the abduction of that country's president, and the daylight execution of US citizen Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis by an ICE agent. The statement explains, and I would urge all those who haven't read it to, after the meeting, go back and look at it, that one event which occurred in a major American city and the other abroad, quote, exposed the consolidation of dictatorship at home and imperialist conquest abroad, rooted not in the personal pathology of Donald Trump, but in the class interests of the capitalist oligarchy that rules the United States. It continues, the murder of Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old mother of 3, has been openly defended by the White House. The administration's praise of the killer and slander of the victim make clear that they intend to use it as a precedent for further killings. The aim is to normalise state murder, expand paramilitary operations in major cities, criminalise dissent, and terrorise the working class. The world has witnessed scenes in the United States of masked Gestapo-style squads swarming through the suburbs, workplaces and shopping centres of major US cities, kidnapping, attacking, arresting and disappearing tens of thousands of immigrants. These events are unprecedented and for many terrifying. The only comparison is to Nazi Germany. The US imperialist seizure of Venezuela and the arrest of Maduro, and an open proclamation that the US plans to run that country and seize its oil resources, is unprecedented. It marks a decisive turn by American imperialism to naked colonial-style plunder and is accompanied by threats of wider confrontation with rival powers and the intensification of militarism at home and abroad. No longer does the US state bother with the pretext that it is defending democratic rights, which accompanied its previous invasions and regime change enterprises. It is now open colonialism imposed by gangsters and gangsterism and illegality. Gone is the unproven allegation that Maduro headed a drug cartel. Trump openly declared, "It is about oil and we want it." In the last few days, Trump and the American oil companies came together in the White House to gloat over their criminal spoils. Trump announced that the Americans will refine and sell and reap the benefits from 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude oil a day, which will continue indefinitely. He referred to the avaricious oil companies, including Exxon, Chevron, and Conoco, as the treasured partners of the US as they plunder Venezuela's oil and assets. The SEP statement that I referred to places these developments in their historical and class context. As the United States approaches the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the democratic principles proclaimed in 1776 are being repudiated in practice. The Bill of Rights is being shredded, while the state apparatus is remodelled on the basis of dictatorship. And one has to say that the events in Venezuela will by no means be the final or only act of the Trump White House. Greenland, Colombia, the Panama Canal, Canada, and Mexico have all been named as possible targets. The seizure of the Venezuelan oil tanker being shadowed by the Russian freighter raises itself the risk of war between two nuclear-armed countries to unprecedented levels. The US imperialist urge to confront its rivals militarily, including China, places the Australian population on the front lines of such a war. The utter madness and recklessness are not the outcome of the mind and personality of Donald Trump, but the deepening crisis of capitalism. Because this attack on democratic rights, and it is not just taking place in the United States, is inseparable from staggering social inequality. A tiny layer of billionaires controls millions of dollars in wealth. While wages fall, jobs are destroyed through automation and AI, and social programs are gutted to finance war and repression. Under these conditions, democratic forms will become incompatible with the preservation of oligarchic rule. And so it is in this international situation that the Bondi massacre occurred and has been used within Australia to accelerate repression. Federal and state Labor governments, together with the security agencies and the corporate media, have rushed to weaponise the attack to suppress the mass movement against Israel's genocide in Gaza. The assault on democratic rights was immediate and concrete. In New South Wales, the Minns government rapidly recalled Parliament and rammed through legislation handing the police commissioner the power to ban demonstrations, an unprecedented restriction on public assembly in this country. At the federal level, while taking a bit longer, Albanese has announced a royal commission not to uncover the worst terrorist event in Australian history, but to establish the lie that the terrorists' actions were the result of the protests against the genocide in Gaza. The Labor government's federal and state governments have signalled the implementation of the recommendations from a Zionist special envoy that would expand censorship and policing in universities, media, and cultural institutions. This is not a narrow attempt to combat extremism. It is the installation of a legal and institutional framework to criminalise dissent and to throttle political mobilisation. Why? Because Albanese will not be forgiven for failing to close down the weekly protests that have been held since October 2023. And anyone who thinks that a Labor government would not carry out such actions must think again. In this, Labor here is following in the footsteps of Keir Starmer, UK Labor Prime Minister, whose government in July of 2025 has illegalised organisations such as Palestine Action under the Terrorism Act due to their opposition to the Gaza genocide. Over 2,700 people have been arrested for supporting Palestine Action, 33 imprisoned, many still on remand, with 3 of the 8 hunger strikers who initially began their protest nearing death. The Starmer government is allowing these people who have been convicted of nothing to die in the cells of a UK prison. The social basis for this assault is the ruling class's fear of the opposition of the population. As across the world, mass opposition to war and social inequality has grown. The streams of anti-genocide demonstrations over the past year have repeatedly shown the capacity of youth and workers to mobilise in extraordinarily large numbers across the globe. The state, the intelligence agencies and sections of the bourgeoisie judge such mobilisation to be an existential threat and one that must be crushed. This development has exposed the political bankruptcy of the trade union leaders, the pseudo-left, and the petty bourgeois currents who pose as an alternative. The trade union bureaucracy is already lining up with the government and big business, capitulating to demands to suppress protests. At the same time, many organisations that brandish the socialist label have shown themselves to be anything but. Instead of pointing to the Labor government's central role in the escalation of repressive measures, sections of the pseudo-left, Socialist Alternative, Socialist Alliance and Solidarity in particular, have hidden, minimised or even defended Labor. Their politics amount to a form of political tutelage to a capitalist administration that is coordinating censorship and expanding policing against the very movement they claim to represent. This isn't a mistake, it's an expression of class collaborationism. A layer of the middle class left has opted to subordinate working class anger to the institutional structures of the capitalist state, to win access and influence inside the existing order rather than to fight for workers' political independence. The political situation in this country is shifting sharply. Once touted as a stable haven of peace and prosperity, always a lie, the real relations and situation have exploded in a violent shattering of this false facade. Labor, long presented as a social democratic guardian of working class interests, has openly positioned itself as the central enforcer of imperialist foreign policy and domestic authoritarianism. From backing Israel's war to deepening alignment with US geostrategic aims in the Indo-Pacific, Labor is accelerating militarisation and remaking Australia into a frontline state for confrontation with China. At home, the same logic that drives support for war, the need to discipline labour, to restructure social spending, to impose a productivity offensive, is being used to justify domestic repression. Higher military spending, aggressive policing, and dismantling of democratic and social rights. What then are the implications for the working class, and what are the tasks before the SEP? First, political independence. Workers must break from the illusions that any section of the bourgeois state, including labour, can be appealed to for protection. The history of imperialism, and this is why we talk about the past. This is why we go back in history, because in order to understand today, we have to go back in history and find the precedents. Because the history of imperialism and of capitalist states shows that appeals to the good intentions of governments and to balanced institutions leave the working class exposed. Our movement must be independent of the union bureaucracy and of the pseudo-left formations that subordinate working class interests to state institutions. The SEP offers a program of class independence. We call for the building of a mass independent political movement of the working class organised on a socialist program, which breaks with capitalism and the imperialist system that breeds murder, war and authoritarianism. Second, defend democratic rights as class rights. The attempts to outlaw protest, to censor, to purge institutions of critical voices must be met not as abstract legal battles, but as essential working class rights. The right to assemble, to protest, and to organise are the class weapons of workers everywhere. We demand the immediate repeal of the New South Wales anti-protest laws, an end to the new hate speech measures that conflate legitimate criticism of states with bigotry, and the restoration of full civil liberties. These are necessary defensive measures to protect workers' capacity to fight strikes, to coordinate strikes, demonstrations, and political action. Our defence of democratic rights must be unconditional and uncompromising. Third, the international working class solidarity. The invasion of Venezuela is a decisive reminder that imperialism abroad and repression at home are two sides of the same coin. The seizure of Maduro, the threats of further military strikes, and the open plans to loot the country's oil resources are part of a global program of capitalist plunder and rearmament. The working class must respond across borders. Australian workers must link their struggle against domestic repression with opposition to imperialist war. Only a united international working class movement can confront the capitalist redivision of the world and its drive to war. Fourth, organise democratically in the workplaces and communities. The SEP calls for the formation of rank-and-file committees in workplaces, in public services, in universities that are independent of the bureaucratic and conciliatory union structures. These committees should coordinate resistance to attacks on jobs, pay and conditions and defend democratic rights. They must be educated politically on the socialist alternative, not merely reactive bodies, but organs of class struggle that can unite industrial action with political mobilisation. Fifth, political leadership and a revolutionary program. The crisis confronting world capitalism demands a political perspective that points beyond reforms within capitalism. The SEP fights for a socialist program that places economic life under public democratic ownership and control, that abolishes the profit motive and that reorganises production to meet social needs rather than the demands of finance capital. The construction of a Trotskyist vanguard, internationally coordinated, is the strategic task in the present conjuncture. The absence of a revolutionary leadership leaves workers and youth susceptible to demoralisation and to the false solutions offered by bourgeois nationalism, pseudo-left electoralism, or fascist demagogy. Practical, immediate steps that workers can take now. Mobilise to defend democratic rights, build and network rank-and-file committees and local defence organisations to protect assemblies and meetings. Demand transparency and an end to cover-ups in investigations of the Bondi attack. Expose and oppose any measures that conflate legitimate political protest with extremism. Join with others across communities, Jews, Muslims, Palestinians, workers of every background, to isolate the reactionary forces that seek to turn this tragedy into an instrument of repression. Finally, the role of the SEP. Our party stands for the independent political organisation of the working class. We will oppose Labor's repressive agenda and the pseudo-left's capitulation to bourgeois institutions. We will organise public meetings, workplace interventions, and rank-and-file networks to educate and mobilise workers. We will link the struggle against cuts, militarisation, and attacks on civil liberties in Australia to the fight against imperialist war, such as the criminal invasion of Venezuela. We invite every worker, every student, and every person committed to democratic and social rights to join our ranks, to take part in our public discussions, and to build the independent organisations of the working class. Comrades and friends, the murder at Bondi is a human tragedy that must be grieved, but the political use to which it is being put must be resisted by organised working class action. The capitalist class will never hand us democracy. We must fight for it. The global drive to war and dictatorship will not be reversed by appeals to the capitalist state. It can only be ended by the international working class taking political power and reorganising society on the basis of genuine democratic control and social need. Join the Socialist Equality Party in building that movement. Take the experience of recent weeks as a call not to despair, but to action, to unite workers, to defend democratic rights, to oppose imperialist war, and to fight for socialism. The SEP will be at your side in this struggle. To organise locally, to attend forthcoming SEP meetings on this crisis and to join our efforts to build a revolutionary workers' movement, contact the SEP branch and participate in our public forums. The defence of democratic rights and the fight against war begins with the political organisation of the working class. And finally, if you agree with this perspective, we urge you to join the SEP and help build our party and the International Committee of the Fourth International. Without that perspective, capitalism will find a way to resolve its crisis. There is never a final crisis of capitalism. It is up to ordinary people to take a stand, to make decisions, and to participate in the fight to resolve the crisis of revolutionary leadership and establish a world socialist movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that I think really riveting and critical report. It's really brought together the historical and international context of the Bondi terror attack, while also drawing out very concretely the tasks that are before the working class here and internationally. And it's with that that we now open the meeting up for questions and discussion. But there have been a few themes that have emerged in the chat over the course of the meeting. There have been a series of questions initially around the Bondi attack, but also connecting that to the questions around Zionism and Israel. I mean, there was a question right at the beginning, who is to blame for the terror attack in Bondi? But there are other questions and comments around the role of Zionism, what the kind of proportion of Jewish people in Australia identify as Zionism. One comment by someone raised, Australian Zionists say Gaza has nothing to do with Bondi, yet will claim Israel represents and speaks for all Jews, really looking at the kind of contradictions that are presented there. I wondered if, Oscar, you could begin by just speaking to some of these comments, and in particular, perhaps working through to a degree some of the questions around Zionism that has emerged in relation to the terror attack.
Yeah, I can make some brief points. You can see there's numbers of comments in the chat. I think the first point is our attitude to the genocide in Gaza. I mean, this is an enormous crime, the mass murder of tens of thousands of people by an advanced capitalist state. And Israel is widely and correctly viewed as a criminal regime. But the point we've made is that this is not just an Israeli genocide. It is being overseen, funded, logistically delivered by the United States, first under Biden and then under Trump. And that reality shouldn't be forgotten. Without the backing of the US, as well as the other imperialist powers, such as Australia, Israel couldn't continue its mass murder of the Palestinians. And what we've explained is that the genocide is not an isolated development. The reason it's being backed by the US and the other major powers is because it is part of a global war that's already developed. It's completely connected to US imperialism's long-standing plans for war against Iran. We saw Trump's strikes against that country last year. That question is very much an open one. Will there be further attacks? Very possible. But then globally, I mean, we've raised that the US is in a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, which threatens a catastrophe across Europe. And in this region, there's a drumbeat for war against China, which is viewed as the chief threat to US imperialist dominance. So I think the point is not just the actions of specific leaders, specific regimes, but recognizing the period that we're in, which is one of a crisis, a breakdown of global capitalism, and the response of the ruling elites everywhere, not simply in Israel, is to turn to militarism and war, as we saw in the 1930s. I think the connection between, or the support by the US for the genocide, its role in the genocide, is significant from a broader standpoint in understanding what the Israeli state is. It's not the homeland of the Jewish people. It's not a state that was created 3,000 years ago at the dawn of Judaism. It is an outpost of world imperialism and particularly US imperialism within the Middle East. That's its function. That's its role. That's why it's supported by all of the major powers. And I think, just responding to some of the comments in the chat, those who say that Israel represents Jewish people, the problem is the Jewish population, essentially accepting the political line of the Zionists. I mean, that's the foundation of the legitimacy of the Israeli state, their claim that they represent Jewry, not only within Israel, but internationally. It's completely false. I mean, this is a state, a capitalist state that represents a capitalist ruling class and the interests of imperialism. I'll just make the point that the conflation of opposition to the genocide with anti-Semitism is completely false. It's reactionary. And certainly the actions of the Israeli state itself fuel anti-Semitism. It's false identification of Jewish people with the horrors that it's committing. But as we've emphasized, I mean, there are broad sections of the Jewish population around the world who have participated in the movement against the genocide. And we don't have time to, give a detailed exposition of the history of Zionism. But its emergence, the emergence of the state of Israel, are very much rooted in the experiences of the 20th century. It should be recalled that in the opening decades of the 20th century, Jewish people were particularly prominent in the socialist movement. Masses of Jewish workers participated in socialist parties in Europe and elsewhere. Zionism was a fringe movement, a nationalist movement based in sections of the petty bourgeoisie, it was really only the horrors of the 1930s and the 1940s, the coming to power of the Nazis as a result of the betrayals of Stalinism, the horrors of the Holocaust, which provided Zionism with a mass political base. So again, if we want to understand, what is a political phenomenon, we have to examine the historical experiences of the 20th century from a class standpoint, from the standpoint of the independent interests of the working class, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, because every form of nationalism, of racism, serves to divide the working class, to strengthen the ruling elites, and so forth. And just the last point I'll make, there's a huge discussion about anti-Semitism, tarring legitimate opposition to the Israeli genocide as anti-Jewish bigotry. That's completely false. But there is a rise of anti-Semitism associated with the far right. Certainly Trump's fascistic movement includes genuine Jew haters. In this country, the sort of anti-immigrant nationalist atmosphere that's been cultivated by Labor, the political establishment, has emboldened the far right. We saw late last year, shortly before the Bondi attack, the neo-Nazi National Socialist Network hold a rally outside the New South Wales Parliament. It was later revealed that the New South Wales police had permitted that event to take place. In all of the discussion post-Bondi about the threat of anti-Semitism, that extraordinary decision has scarcely been mentioned, nor the danger posed by these fascist forces, which have to be opposed by the development of an independent movement of the working class.
Thanks, Oscar. There are the senior members of the Socialist Equality Party who can also speak. They can raise their hand and we can call on them to speak to answer any of the questions that have come up. I mean, there are further questions that around the question of Bondi and commentary around it, as well as broader comments, while not direct questions, on some of the history of the role of US imperialism, including its, as others have said, different imperialist interventions into the Middle East, the connection between that and the rise of forces like IS. I mean, there is, in that sense, a great deal that participants are working through. But to begin to answer and to add some further points to what has been raised by Oscar, I'll now introduce Mike Head, who is again, a prolific writer for the World Socialist website. He's been a leading member of the SEP for many decades and wrote many of the early pieces on the Bondi terror attack immediately after it had occurred and really laid the basis for our analysis. So I'll hand over now to Mike to make some points.
Thanks, Max. Look, I want to agree very strongly with the points just made by Oscar and both yourself and Cheryl about the complete opposition between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. As Marxists, as revolutionary socialists, as internationalists, we are completely opposed to anti-Semitism, which has a long, filthy, and dirty history. Hatred towards Jews has been used historically to divide the working class and bolster the most reactionary regimes, including going back to the Tsarist regimes in Russia, the pogroms against Jews in Russia and elsewhere in the 19th century, and of course, most notoriously by the Nazis in the 1930s, leading to the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were massacred, but they were massacred not just out of some blind hatred of Jews, but for definite class reasons, because there was a strong movement among Jewish workers and intellectuals themselves towards socialism, towards Marxism. It's not an accident that some of the leading Marxists were of Jewish origin, including Karl Marx and Leon Trotsky, to name just two of many. Zionism was a product at the end of the 19th century, originally a fringe movement, but which then exploited the Holocaust itself to divert that movement towards, well, assimilation, towards a class unity in the struggle against capitalism, the ultimate source of class oppression, including of the, Jews themselves, to divert that into a separatist, apartheid-like state, which has nothing to do with religion in any genuine sense, but is a product of imperialism itself. I mean, the Fourth International opposed the establishment of Israel in 1948. We warned, and Leon Trotsky warned earlier, that it would be, such a state would be a trap for the Jews themselves, that they would become cannon fodder, a garrison state to enforce the interests of imperialism throughout the Middle East and more broadly. Now, I encourage everybody who's on the call today to read the lectures on the World Socialist website by David North, and they're also available in a book form. These lectures trace the history of anti-Semitism and the bringing forward of Zionism as a diversionary trap for the Jewish people themselves. But I won't speak at length. I just conclude by, again, emphasising, as Cheryl did at the end of the meeting, at the end of her report, the most important conclusion that must be drawn from this discussion is the need for a genuine revolutionary Marxist internationalist party. That's our party, the Socialist Equality Party and the Fourth International. We have a proud history, a long history of struggle, including against Stalinism, which also, in its own form, formed a unity with anti-Semites in all sorts of ways. So I just encourage people to read the material on our website and to seriously consider joining and building our party as the only way forward for the international working class. And don't be diverted into blaming the Jews themselves for the crimes of the Zionist state, which is as Oscar and others have explained, is being used by imperialism. What's happening in Gaza and the Middle East is part of a broader picture to reorganize the entire Middle East under the hegemony of US imperialism as a base for a wider conflict against both Russia and particularly against China, as is the case with what is taking place in Venezuela as well. So you need to have a broader perspective and a historically informed perspective. I encourage everyone to get in touch, if you're not already in touch with our party, for a discussion and a real clarification of these big historical issues. That's all for now. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. There are numbers of themes emerging with some of the questions, particularly on the question of social equality in Australia or socialism and how it is possible. There are two kind of interconnected questions around that we can look to deal with. One is, how can we get social equality in Australia, with one participant saying that they are poor on the DSP or disability support pension, can't afford anything. What happens to them? Social equality and capitalism are impossible. But then an interrelated comment from someone in the question and answers pane, it says, is the SEP the only pathway? Is it unrealistic to expect elements of the ALP to redirect to the same ends as the SEP aims are? And so, that will be, just raising that'll be answered in the course of some of the discussion. But I think to work over even more the kind of underlying objective economic processes that are giving rise to the crisis of capitalism, I'll call now on Nick Beams to answer. I mean, he is the former National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party, a world-leading expert on Marxist economy. He's written numerous articles for the World Socialist website, and would like to make some comments on the discussion.
Thank you, Max. Yes, I think there is a very important issue that we have to confront, And that is, we've said that Trump is not acting as an individual. He represents a class. And such actions as we now have can only be understood if we probe deeper to the economic foundations of this eruption of imperialist gangsterism abroad and mass repression at home seen in the murder of Rene Good. Now, the Marxist movement has been under attack on this question for many decades. We have been told that the analysis that the Marxist movement made at the beginning of the 20th century of the logic of imperialism, of the economic foundations which led it to World War I, that this was a war for resources, colonies, and so on, produced by the deepening crisis of global capitalism, and this remained the fundamental driving force. This was declared to be dogmatic, crude, and so on, for many decades by right-wing bourgeois economists, and most importantly also by pseudo-Marxists. Well, facts, as they say, are stubborn things. We now have the mask of all of this ripped off. Even the bourgeois press has to recognise. I have before me an article from the Financial Times published just in the last couple of days. It says the new era of resource imperialism. Imperialism is back. The mask is ripped off. Now, what are the underlying driving forces behind that? That requires, of course, we examine the economic processes that are at work. Let's take the question of the United States. We made the point in our New Year's statement that underlying this development, the deeper questions are the enormous economic crisis of US imperialism. For the last 50 or so years, the world has functioned on the basis of the US dollar as the global currency. The gold backing was removed by Nixon in 1971. This enabled and opened the way for an enormous process of financialization, not as in the past, profit being made by the development of industry, but above all, increasingly by financial speculation. But this is run into objective limits. The United States now has a national public debt of $38 trillion. Every institution in the United States, Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, you name it, has said this increase is unsustainable. We now have a situation where the whole global monetary system and US financial system as well, the leading centre of this, is based upon the most indebted country in the world. An economy that now bases itself on parasitism, because that's what Wall Street speculation is about, that's what financial speculation is about. It's not the creation of new value, it's financial manipulation. And imperialism is a direct product of this financial parasitism. Parasitism leads to the grabbing of resources, value, from internationally around the world, and from the deepening attacks on the working class at home. The prospect is put forward by bourgeois representatives, well, perhaps AI, artificial intelligence, or we have said augmented intelligence, is going to provide, through its enormous development of productivity, going to provide a way forward. It is not. It is not. Because what it's going to be used for, and what it is being used for, is to create mass layoffs of tens of thousands of workers, hundreds of thousands, millions, as different sections of capital strive to appropriate what they can of the surplus value that it's extracted from the working class. So these are the fundamental driving forces. Now, just as we were told that our analysis, developed, of course, by Vladimir Lenin in his work, Imperialism, which I also urge comrades to read, it's so relevant to today, and Trotsky and many other Marxists at the beginning of this century of imperialism, just as that was declared to be dogmatic, unreal, and so on, so was the attack launched against the perspective of the Marxist movement, which insisted that socialism is not some good idea that might perhaps be realised and so on, but really not viable. No, we insisted that socialism is not some utopia for which we have to fight for. It's an immediate necessity. It is the only alternative to capitalist barbarism. There is no other road. I emphasise that point. Leon Trotsky said, well, if you reject a socialist program to meet the crisis of capitalism, then another program will be imposed on you. The program of fascism, war, authoritarianism that we see now directly. It's not something I'm making up. It's there. It's in everyday reality. Can the Labor Party, the question is raised, somehow make a turn? Well, let's look at the history. Don't look at individuals. Try and lift up their skulls and see what might change them. No, we examine parties historically. Historically, what is the Labor Party? It is the chief instrument of bourgeois rule in this country. What is its record on war? It has supported every war launched by United States imperialism. It was the Labor Party which entered the Great War to defend the interests of the British Empire in 1914. The Labor Party that carried through the Second World War, led the government in the Second World War. The Labor Party that has supported the Korean War, has supported every war of imperialism. It supported, although it wasn't in office, but it gave tacit support to the attack on Iraq. And whatever they try to cover up their role in that, the Labor leader, or foreign minister, foreign affairs spokesman at the time, Kevin Rudd, later to become the leader of the Labor Party, said there is no doubt, he said, that Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction. The crucial big lie that was promoted to advance the war in 2003. So if you're looking for some change of heart in the leaders of the Labor Party and so on, well, you're on a false perspective. But that's the perspective that's advanced, promoted and pushed, as Cheryl and other comrades have outlined, by the pseudo-left. It must be entirely rejected. That's not to say that individual members of the Labor Party, drawing from their experience, will come to join the Socialist Equality Party. We think they will, because reality is now exposing what this party is once again. But the Labor Party making a turn? No. This is a party of imperialism. It's a party of war. We judge individuals not what they say about themselves, but by their history. The history of the Labor Party is one of support for imperialist war, because imperialist war arises out of the very logic of the capitalist system. And it's the response of capitalism to its deepening economic crisis, a point Trotsky made at the beginning of World War I. It was that Second World War was a continuation of that war, and now we have the eruption once again of imperialism openly, nakedly, spewing out of the mouth of Donald Trump. He doesn't, as comrades have remarked, make any bones about it. It's not democratic rights or Maduro's a drug runner, which is completely bogus. No, it's oil. The desperate struggle for resources, for profits, to be imposed by all means possible. And that underscores the necessity for the overthrow of the profit system, that wars arise out of a social system, not out of the heads of individuals, but a social system that is based upon the private appropriation of profit, the private ownership of the means of production against the class that creates all the wealth, and that is the working class. And that perspective now, the expropriation of the expropriators, must be now carried forward and made the basis of the international struggle of the working class. This attack is an expression of the extreme weakness, crisis of the imperialist regimes. As we've said, Trump may say, "Oh well, I'm going to carry on with whatever's in my mind at the time." Well, there's a bigger force that will stop Donald Trump and the imperialist gangsters around the world, and that's the working class. It is the producer of all wealth. It has the real power. That power must be unleashed through the development of a conscious socialist program. That is the force which can overthrow imperialism. What it requires to be realised is a revolutionary leadership, and that's the leadership that must be built today by building the Socialist Equality Party, the International Committee of the Fourth International, and educating other workers. So I would join with the other speakers in urging today that you make the most important decision of your life and join the Socialist Equality Party and build the revolutionary socialist movement, which is the only movement which can lead to a future fit for our children to live in and for generations to come. We are facing an existential crisis in which this is the central question. We have to act, and act decisively now.
Well, thanks, Nick, for that important contribution. So I'll hand back to Cheryl, who'd like to make some points.
Thanks, Max. Just briefly, I just wanted to address the question that our friend in the chat raised about, is there a difference between terrorist attacks in underdeveloped countries such as Sri Lanka, India, to advanced capitalist countries? No, there's not. And the attack that was referenced, the Easter attack, which took place in April of 2019 in Colombo, which was carried out. It was the bombing of 3 churches, 3 Christian churches and 3 luxury hotels. And it was carried out by ISIS. It resulted in the deaths of more than 290 people. 500 others were injured. These were, in many cases, foreign nationals, but also locals, those that worked in the hotels that went to these churches. I mean, this was a murderous counter-revolutionary attack, and created the conditions in Sri Lanka. The government of Sirisena Wickremesinghe responded by blacking out all social media, declared a state of emergency, revived sweeping anti-terror laws, and they were used to round up opponents of the government. They increased and intensified surveillance and repression. It opened up a attack on Muslims. What was whipped up was an anti-Muslim campaign in which Muslim communities were violently targeted by security forces as well as others. And the position of the Socialist Equality Party in Sri Lanka was a complete opposition and denunciation of this attack, as we have done here. The political role of these measures are identical, notwithstanding what country that they occur in. And Sri Lanka has had a terrible experience with the role of terrorism throughout its history, and in which hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, in that sense, have been killed through these forms of political assault. And it therefore I come to it in that sense from this standpoint about the question that was raised by another of our attendees as to why we make I think the question was why we make potshots at the pseudo-lefts and these other organisations. Why don't we get together with them? First of all, we don't make potshots. We have engaged and undertaken a profound and in-depth political analysis of the role of these organisations and the political positions to which they adhere. And while an organisation may call itself left, it may present itself, although increasingly they don't, as Trotskyist and socialist, it is necessary for all those workers and young people and professionals who are interested, you have to look at the political program that these organisations fight for, the role of its leaders, the methods and positions which they put forward in terms of the actions of the working class. Now, these organisations, their position is that pressure, appeals, protest will in some form or other, and they put caveats on it that, yes, Labor is not carrying out the program that we would hope for, but that Labor is a lesser evil, is better than the Liberals, it's better than One Nation, that therefore we've got to utilise the mass movement of workers to pressure Labor and such political formations and governments to provide a better outcome than one would get through the Liberals. Well, this is entirely wrong. It has been proved in history that it is wrong. In fact, the role of social democracy, and if one goes back to 1914, August the 4th, 1914, in which the social democratic organisations in Europe, the German Social Democrats and others, voted in favour of war credits to enable their own bourgeoisie to undertake to have at their access the funding for the militarisation and fighting the war. Without that, there would not have been the possibility of World War I. And the measures, and the same can be gone through in terms of the role of social democracy, of the Stalinists in the lead up to World War II. These organisations that call themselves socialists, that workers' organisations, they have to be their history, their role, their political background has to be understood and dealt with. And these organisations that were in fact like Socialist Alliance, Socialist Alternative, that broke with the Trotskyist movement, and they didn't break with it because of misunderstandings. They broke with the Trotskyist movement because they opposed the independent development of the working class in opposition to Stalinism and fundamentally social democracy, the Labour parties. And so our opposition to these organisations is not tactical. It's not, as is put forward, taking pot shots. It's because their program will ensure the continued existence and survival of capitalism. And if that takes place, world war is inevitable. Yes, it will be difficult to overthrow capitalism, but what is impossible is the reform of capitalism under conditions in which the economic and productive basis, economic basis of capitalism is now entirely incapable of providing any of the basic requirements of the masses of the world. And so we have to fight to ensure that ordinary people understand that difference. And it's unclear, it's difficult, no one is denying that. That's why people have to study. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Cheryl. And I think those remarks really do highlight the absolute necessity of the development of the Socialist Equality Party. I mean, there was a question that Nick answered earlier on, couldn't members of the ALP move to the left or something along those lines? No. I mean, the history has shown the opposite. They move to the right. The pseudo-left layers, as Cheryl said, we don't take pot shots. I mean, they have moved in the most reactionary direction. The answer to the crisis that confronts mankind is the development of the world Trotskyist movement, that is, in Australia, the Socialist Equality Party, which is the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. I would like to now return to what I raised in my opening remarks on the launch and development of Socialism AI. And in the course of this, I want to raise, I guess in that sense, some of the points that came up in the chat around Socialism AI. There were positions on the role of AI to cause speed-ups for workers, in that sense, to attack workers' conditions, the role of AI and the big data centers, which are, extracting massive amounts of water from the ground, causing ecological disasters, among other things. I mean, these are, in that sense, true. In the hands of the capitalist class, AI, really not artificial intelligence. I mean, and we can put this in the chat, there was a very important video launching Socialism AI in which David North made the important characterization that it's better to call it not artificial, but augmented intelligence. Artificial begins to mystify the idea that it is somehow separate from human intelligence, but in fact, it is the product of, in that sense, the sum total of human knowledge and development over thousands of years, but in particular, the last few hundred. And concentrated in on that, it can augment one's intelligence. It is seen in that sense not as a replacement for the working class, not as a replacement for the Socialist Equality Party, but as a critical tool for the development of the work of the responsibilities of the working class, both here and internationally, but of the work of the movement as a whole. I mean, it gives you at your fingertips the ability to have a discussion on complex historical and political questions in a manner that is just not possible with any of the other chatbots who operate and are trained on algorithms of really the ruling class. Now, it can be used obviously in conjunction with other AIs, but it is, as I said, quite a powerful tool. And I think those who are here today, as I said, when this meeting concludes, you should sign up for Socialism AI. I mean, it is like something you haven't encountered before. And to answer some of those questions that came up, in the hands of the working class, this tool can transform society. I mean, we, as the Trotskyist movement, do not reject technology and its development. The World Wide Web, or the internet, was at one stage conceived by a whole layer as this ruining intelligence, that this would be a profound problem for many around the world. We recognized the importance of it and launched the World Socialist website, of which the pseudo-left layers, of which, as Cheryl said, we don't just take pot shots at. I mean, their conception was we were getting lost in cyberspace. Well, now the internet is more than ubiquitous. It is almost a basic right that it has to be in existence for access to any and all knowledge. And AI, in a different capacity, will develop along those lines to augment intelligence as a vital tool. So as I said, I encourage everybody here today to sign up. There are links in the chat. You can just type in socialismai.com and begin using it today. Finally, and I think all the speakers today have, both in terms of the contributions and the reports, have indicated this. I encourage everyone here to make the most important decision of your life and join the Socialist Equality Party. The revolutionary movement is of profound necessity. It is not simply an option of it would be better to have socialism. What confronts humanity and the developments in Venezuela, as well as these shootings in Bondi, demonstrate this, and particularly the reaction by the Labor government here, is that it is not a question of socialism as just a better option. If capitalism is allowed to continue in the manner that it does, it will lead to mass war, and barbarism on a scale dwarfing even that of the Second World War. But the same processes that give rise to war give rise to its opposite. Millions of workers are beginning to question the society that they are around. They are looking for an alternative. And so in advance of the mass revolutionary struggles that are coming, and are coming rapidly, the party, in that sense, must grow and develop. And so I encourage you all today, make the most important decision of your life. Apply to join the Socialist Equality Party and join the ranks of the world revolutionary movement. With that, I want to conclude the meeting. Thank the speakers again, Oscar, Cheryl, for their important and critical contributions and reports. I thank those who participated both in the questions and the chat, and the contributions by Mike and Nick. But with that, I would like to call the meeting closed. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance.